Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm President and founder of AuditNet, and today's webinar is IT Audit Webinar Training via Practical Application, presented jointly by AuditNet and Richard Cascarino and Associates. This webinar is part of the Training Without Travel series covering IT audit, and joining me today is Richard Cascarino. There is my background. I'll let Richard introduce himself. And then I will cover the housekeeping items and we'll get right into today's webinar. Richard?
Thanks, Jim. Hi. I hope everyone can hear me okay. For you who have meeting me for the first time, my name is Richard Cascarino. I'm a principal of Richard Cascarino and Associates based in Colorado and in Johannesburg in South Africa. And today I'm actually broadcasting from South Africa. My background, I've got a depressing number of years in IT audit training and consultancy. I am a past president of the Institute of Internal Auditors in South Africa, and I established the African region for the IIA Inc. I'm a member of ASACA, a member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and I'm actually on the Board of Regents for Higher Education for the ACFE. And I'm the author of a few books. You'll see some of them up there, most relevant of which for this particular course is The Auditor's Guide to IT Auditing, which is now in its second edition. We'll be covering a variety of topics, but before we do that, let me hand you back to Jim, and he can take you through some of the housekeeping for the webinar.
Thank you, Richard. Let me just go over the housekeeping items very quickly. We are recording today's webinar. However, we ask that you not record it, and this is just for our purposes and to share with you, but we don't want it recorded and shared with anybody else. AuditNet and Richard Cascarino are not responsible for later rivals or connection problems. Please make sure the pop-ups are allowed on your computer. Again, we are recording today's webinar, and you'll receive a link to that recording, and you will receive that within 5 to 7 business days. We'll try to get that out hopefully within the next day or two. In addition, the views expressed today do not necessarily represent the views, positions, or opinions of AuditNet or Richard Cascarino and Associates, so there may be some disclaimers there, and we'll show you a screen on disclaimers as well. Today's information is strictly for educational purposes and does not constitute accounting or legal advice or create a client relationship. You can ask questions during the webinar. Use the chat box on the lower right hand of your display. Type in the question and click send. Either myself or Richard will respond either by private message or, if appropriate, to the entire group. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will receive an evaluation questionnaire. Please complete the evaluation questions to help us improve our future events. Attending the live event does qualify you for CPE. You must be in attendance for a minimum of 100 minutes for this session, and you must answer the required polling questions. Only those who are in attendance and answer all the polling questions will receive NASBA CPE certificates. Viewing the recording does not qualify for CPE. Please allow 5 to 7 business days to receive the certificate, and if you have any questions, you can either contact myself or you can contact Richard. If the webinar, if GoToWebinar does stop working, you may need to close and restart. You can always dial in and listen and follow along with the handout. The next screen contains the disclaimer, and you've all received the handout, so I'm not going to read the disclaimer, but at this point I would like to turn it over to Richard for him to get into today's topic of contingency planning. Richard?
Okay, thanks, Jim. I put the disclaimer up on the screen. We have a slight time lag between here and America, so when I put it up, I can see it, and I can see that you can't see it. However, you can now see, you should now be able to see today's agenda. So what are we going to cover today? I have to say today, at the moment, the inclination is to say this evening, because it's 6 p.m. here. So if I do that inadvertently, please, I apologize. We're going to have a look at what is a disaster. There's an old saying that to err is human, to really mess it up, you need a computer. So we'll take a look at disasters, going beyond the concept of a computerized disaster recovery plan to look at it from a corporate survival plan. So we'll take a look within the IT environment as to what is a disaster recovery plan and who is accountable for the DRP. We'll take a look at what are the options, what kind of a disaster recovery plan can you have. Well, what one should you have depends largely on the type of disaster that you're trying to cater for. We'll have a look at the cost and the cost implications of the different options that are available. And we come to perhaps one of the most critical areas. How can a contingency plan, and I'm talking business contingency as well as IT contingency plan, how can we actually genuinely test that? There's an awful lot of so-called testing of contingency plans, and they work right up till the time that you actually have a disaster. We'll take a look at what is management's role, what is the user's role, what is the information services role, and we'll finish up with what is the internal auditor's role in assisting the organization achieve its disaster recovery goal. Just to look at it from a before and after picture, and you'll see there perhaps the best prepared organizations are the ones who have lived through a calamity. There was a study done some years ago in Cape Town for an MBA looking at companies which had a computerized disaster recovery plan. And they found that although the bulk of companies did not believe that they had a disaster recovery plan, they did believe that they had tested it, even if it didn't exist. And the ones who did have a disaster recovery plan claimed that they had had a disaster and survived. In the same study, they discovered that where companies admitted that they had not had a disaster recovery plan, within a year, after the disaster, 40% of them were no longer in existence. So perhaps the best prepared are the ones who've actually survived through it. And believe me, when I was an IT manager, we had a disaster. It was of a nature that our DRP was not able to cater for. We survived by everyone working through the night 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for about 3 weeks. And our disaster recovery plan was a hell of a lot better after that. So when you start looking at what should we have a disaster recovery plan for, you've got to start off by assessing what risks do we face. Now the obvious ones are the standard fire, flood, building collapse, etc. And people said when 9/11 happened, oh, our disaster recovery plan was never geared towards a building collapse. And in many cases, companies who were in Twin Towers 1 did have a disaster recovery plan, but their hot site was in the second World Trade Center, and that went down too. But building collapse is not limited to 9/11. We've had occasions where buildings have collapsed with computer centers in them. Companies have survived and other companies have failed. Explosion, accidental explosion, sabotage, or terrorism. A friend of mine worked in a computer center in Northern Ireland. They had a phone call in the times of troubles saying there was a bomb in the building. They followed the DRP and they evacuated down the main staircase and out through the fire exits. Meanwhile, the people in IT said, oh, it's just another bomb scare, and spent their time putting away the disks into fireproof safes, etc., before they moved to the main staircase. And they were very fortunate that they did, because there was a bomb, and the bomb had been placed in the main staircase, and it caught the data prep department as they were evacuating the building, and it just tore them to shreds. And as Bill said to me afterwards, he said, you don't actually understand a disaster until you've been in one. Those are the obvious ones that we tend to think of. When we think of a disaster, we think of total unavailability of the computer center. It's gone, it's disappeared, bang, boom, flooded out, whatever. But it needn't necessarily be that type of risk that you face. It could be an industrial failure. It could be a strike. If your workers go on strike and put a picket line around your building so that IT staff cannot cross the picket line, what are you going to do if you can't run your computer? It could be power failure. And it could be power failure because of weather conditions. It could be power failure because of a problem at your power utility. It could simply be loss of data. A virus could be a disaster if you're not ready to cope with it. And the Lord protect us, it could be deliberate sabotage on behalf of your own staff. When we start looking at all of these contingencies and saying, well, our disaster recovery plan has to cater for a disaster in whichever form it comes, we also have to look at the possibility of deliberate action by your own staff or by outsiders, someone hacking into your systems. Many years ago, there was a hacking event was prosecuted, and this was in the days of apartheid, and it was an international one, and the hacking community held a trial by computing in a computer in the Netherlands, and hackers from all over the world signed in. And the question was, is it ethically acceptable to hack for political reasons? And after much debate, the hacking community decided no, it was not ethical to hack for political reasons. And then one final question came in from Australia and said, if the company you were hacking was South African and you were giving the information to the anti-apartheid movement, would that be ethical? And there was a loud silence on the other end. So to a certain extent, whether it is deemed to be ethical to hack for political reasons depends on your political agenda. But we are all vulnerable, potentially, particularly vulnerable to penetration through the internet, as well as through our own electronic data interchange between ourselves and our customers and ourselves and our suppliers. So when we start thinking in terms of putting together a contingency plan, we've got to think in the different types of disaster. Now this is a type A disaster. Type A disaster involves total loss, loss of people, loss of buildings, loss of factory, loss of finance, loss of credibility, loss of materials, and loss of computers. And it could be caused by explosion, aircraft crashing, total fire, floods, industrial action, earthquake, or sabotage. But one way or another, type A disaster says it's gone. Therefore, if you want to recover from that, you better have an alternative to all of those things, an alternative to your people, an alternative to your building. We had a case in Pretoria, in a government building, where they had tested their contingency plans, and they discovered that the fireproof door were 30-hour doors. In other words, they would were 3-hour doors. They would stand a temperature of so many degrees on one side of the door for 3 hours before it burned through. And they said that's below building standards, it's going to be 5-hour doors. So they bought 5-hour doors, put them in the basement, and instead of replacing the doors one at a time, they took down all of the 3-hour doors, and before the 5-hour doors were up, they had a fire and the whole building was wiped out. Fortunately, it was overnight, so that it was unattended. Nevertheless, every single computer, every single local area network, every server, gone. So a type A disaster says complete wipeout. How are you going to recover? Very, very expensive when they happen. Fortunately, they don't happen all that often. So we have to cater for a type B disaster. Again, the causes could be fire, flood, industrial action, and it could result in loss of hardware, loss of software, or simply loss of your own in-house data. But it's typically a temporary loss. Now, how long could your organization survive a temporary loss before a type B disaster becomes a type A disaster? Depends on the nature of the industry, depends on your place in that industry, if you're the industry leader, if everyone is following you. We can also get a type C disaster. And a type C disaster involves typically the loss of software or the ability to recover your in-house data. So in other words, your computer may be sitting there quite happy. Your hot site is of no use because there's nothing wrong with your hardware. But you've had a problem with the software. Someone has overwritten it. Someone has dropped a disk pack. Or someone has accidentally overwritten all of your in-house data. So now you have to go back to backup and hope to God that your backups are recoverable. And again, it can happen because of an explosion of fire, flood, freak atmospheric conditions. It could be deliberate sabotage again on the part of your own staff or outsiders. It could simply be a bad system design, that what you thought was covered wasn't, or poor operating standards. When you thought the backups were being taken, they weren't. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, I worked for a company in Scotland, and every night they took the backups and they put the backups in a fireproof safe in the manager's office, the IS manager. They took the one that was already in there and they took that to the off-site storage. So last night's backup was in the fireproof safe, and the night before went off to the off-site storage, and it was kept for so many cycles, and everything sounded wonderful. Unfortunately, they did this at 5 o'clock at night. Now, at 5 o'clock at night, the people who were working late went to a vending machine and bought egg sandwiches and various other things. And then they walked back into the programming room and they put them in a microwave and heated them up. And the microwave had a leak round the door, which nobody knew about. But this was happening at 5 o'clock at night, which was the time that they opened the doors for the fireproof safe and put the new backups into the fireproof safe. And every time they opened those doors when the microwave was running, it wiped every tape that was in there, including the ones that were about to go to the off-site storage. So they were going through all of the operating standards, but they had one poor operating condition with a microwave, and it was wiping out all of the backups. Could you survive? Disaster D is perhaps the most common form of disaster. This is simply a partial loss of software so that you cannot quickly recover. And it's the kind of thing that happens when a virus strikes or when somebody accidentally overwrites by installing some new software. And it can happen that it's the auditors who install a new piece of software and damage the client's machine. Typical cause, some form of computer operational error. We pushed the wrong button, we loaded the wrong software, we accidentally overrode. Have you ever had the experience of formatting a disk and it says, "Are you sure?" And you say, "Of course I'm sure, yes." And then you realize it's the hard disk on the machine. If it's never happened to you, it will, sooner or later. Over the course of my extensive career, it's happened to me twice. Fortunately, on both occasions, it was my machine. Unfortunately, on both occasions, we had backups and we were able to recover. But it was operational error. It could be deliberate destruction. We worry about viruses, we worry about them coming in from the outside, and we've all got antivirus software. The easiest way to destroy a system with a virus is for the person who's running the system to go to the antivirus software and switch it off. Then import a file with the virus, and then, oh my goodness, look, I've been hit by a virus. We always assume if you're hit by a virus it was accidental. Maybe it wasn't. It could be bad system design, or again, it could be poor operating standards. How bad could it be? Well, that depends on your organization, and it depends on what you use your IT systems for. It could be loss of revenue, simply the fact that the system is unavailable, so there are delays in invoicing, you're perhaps losing interest that you should have got, you've lost sales that you could have got, and you've lost future business because people can't get through to you and they go off to someone else. So simple denial of service, and that could cost you a lot of money. Even if you can recover, you've got backups, you can go to your backups, you can replace equipment, there are going to be additional costs. There's going to be time, extra manning costs during the disaster. There's going to be interest on loans. There's going to be a loss of discounts because you were not able to pay on time. At minimum, there's going to be inefficiencies within your systems. If you're actually running your factory through the computer system, then your production control can go for a burden. And you can lose production, you can have schedule disruption, you can upset your customers, and you can have legal issues, penalty clauses. Could a disaster put you out of business? A temporary disaster put you out of business? Many years ago, there was a firm in Scotland who built ships, and they also built oil rigs. Now, an oil rig at that time cost about £200 million to build. And if you're building an oil rig and spending that kind of money, you want it delivered on time. Now, this particular company had a 6-year order book for oil rigs. But they had a penalty clause that said if we don't deliver on time, for every day that we are late, we will take a £1 million penalty, because it will cost the company, our customer, £1 million to hire an oil rig for that period of time. They introduced a new computer system, a new computer-assisted design system for designing oil rigs. And it took them 2 weeks to get it up and running, as a result of which they were 2 weeks late. They never caught that 2 weeks up. They lost £14 million in penalty clauses, and they went bankrupt with a full order book. At minimum, you're going to generate ill will from your customers, who initially will be sympathetic that you've had a disaster, but then when your disaster starts becoming their problem, they're less happy. There'll be ill will from your shareholders, who will say, why weren't you ready? And there will be ill will from the staff, who will all work together initially, but eventually are going to turn around and say, why am I living through this hell? I did a survey back in 2011 of my clients, and I looked at where they were with disaster recovery planning, and this was pure IT. On the mainframe, 77% said they had a disaster recovery plan. 23% said they didn't. 18% said they were in the middle of doing a plan for the first time, and 5% said we'll worry about that when we come to it. On local area networks, that fell. Instead of having mainframes when they were running based on LANs, 51%, just over half, had a disaster recovery plan. 30% had no plan and no intention of putting together a plan. For those working within the cloud environment, 35% said we assume that someone else, 35% had a DRP that said if we're unable to contact the cloud, we will do the following. which, put it another way, 65% said if the cloud is unavailable, we're out of business. Now, having a disaster recovery plan doesn't necessarily mean that it will work in the event of a disaster. It depends on how good it is, and it depends on how well it's been tested. Where are we going in the future? Well, more and more we're seeing companies dependent on cloud systems. We're seeing the introduction of integrated data warehouses. We're seeing integrated office systems. We're seeing EDI everywhere. Internet trading, and that means that when you are developing systems or implementing new systems or changes to systems, you have to consider that contingency plan during systems planning, whether you're buying a package or developing something in-house or buying something on the cloud. At the end of the day, your computer disaster recovery plan is part of an overall corporate survival plan. And that means that we have to have available to us all of the resources. Men, sorry ladies, we class it as the 5 M's. Men, money, materials, machines and methods. You don't count women because, as everyone knows, women will work twice as hard as men anyway. So, men, money, materials, machines and methods. Machines and methods are IT are included in there. We are, within our IT systems, a resource, a critical resource, but only one of the resources. And corporate survival is the responsibility of everyone. It is not a computer problem, it's a business problem. Computer may be part of the solution to that business problem, but it's not a business problem. Therefore, it's the responsibility of the board, executive management, senior management, juniors, the cleaning staff. It's a responsibility of us all. Where the computer comes in is simply as another resource. These days, for most companies, it is a prime resource. And that means that we need expertise available to get us back up and running. Recovery will not be instantaneous. Doesn't matter how good your disaster recovery plan is. Return to normal takes even longer. For many large organizations and institutions such as banks, they will have mirror systems running where they can flip over from one to another. And the recovery may be under 2 minutes. But under 2 minutes is still not instantaneous. And if you're a large bank at a critical time of the day, you're going to upset a lot of customers. To get you back into your normal environment can take a hell of a lot longer. So some in-depth planning is required, and the primary objective is corporate survival. So, that being said, what do we need our plan to be? An effective plan has to be comprehensive. It's got to cover for a type A disaster, but it's also got to cover for a type D disaster. I had a situation when I was running a diploma series of IT courses, and one guy came in to one of the weeks and he was supposed to bring in his project that he'd been working on, and it wasn't there. I said, what happened? He said, well, the system crashed and they recovered all of the software and they recovered all of the data, but they hadn't been backing up my data. I said, well, how do you know that they backed up anybody else's data? He said, well, I assume that they did. I said, you assume that they backed up yours as well. So his next project that he did for his next week in the course was to go and do a review of disaster recovery planning and how it was tested and was it adequate. I will not tell you what the results were, but there was an awful lot of work had to be done after that. So the plan is going to be comprehensive. It's got to be dynamic because your business is going to change and your IT is going to change, and the IT dependence on The business dependence on your IT will change. It has to be usable. It has to be relevant to your business risks. It's got to be tested and tested properly, and we'll look at that. It's got to be up to date with your current situation, and it's got to be known. People have to know where their role is in this disaster recovery plan. There's no point in saying we now have a disaster, let's get the plan and read it. So, disasters themselves could be application dependent. In other words, if the system goes down, loss of not every application will be a disaster. If you lose the general ledger, it may be a disaster to your financial accounting system or your financial accounting department, but the company could quite happily carry on for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks perhaps, before it became company critical. On the other hand, if it's your manufacturing control system, 4 hours and you could be out of business. It could be calendar dependent, depending on what time of the month it happens or what time of the year it happens. If you lose your payroll system immediately after you run your monthly payroll, you've got a month before it becomes critical. If you lose the payroll system 1 hour before you run your payroll, you've got a problem. It could be installation dependent. Bear in mind the total loss, the probability of total loss is low, but the impact on the business is high. Probability of a minor loss is high, but the impact on the business is low. So we have to start thinking in terms of where are we within our IT systems. So the question is, how do we get started? If you're starting a DRP from scratch, first and foremost, establish the terms of reference. Under whose authority is this being put together? Who's going to be in charge? In the event of a disaster, who has the authority to declare a disaster? Because the minute you say we have a disaster, run the plan, you're going to cost the company money. And it could be substantial money. So it requires someone with enough seniority to make that statement. Identify emergency lines of reporting, because the assumption that you have to make is in the event of a disaster, the people who you normally report to will not be available. They could have gone up in smoke. Establish an emergency strategy. Common problem that you find is that people immediately assume that if the computer goes down, we have to replace the computer. If your payroll system is unavailable, then worst case scenario, pay the people what you paid them last week. Any new employees, pay them manually. Any overtime will catch up on last week. Some people will get paid money they're not entitled to. Some people will get not paid money they should have got. We can sort that out next week, but everyone will get paid something. We don't necessarily need to recover the payroll system immediately. So what will my emergency strategy be? Depends on the applications, depends on the business. What are your terms of reference? And it's going to be firmly recognized and accepted that policy decisions and the overall responsibility for the corporate contingency plan rests entirely with top management. They can delegate responsibility to execute the plan, but it's their responsibility to make sure that they have a plan which is executable. And that's one of the roles of internal audit, is to audit that on behalf of executive management, to give them the assurance that their disaster recovery plan should allow them to recover from a disaster. So there are 3 areas that we have to look at when doing our planning. We have to look at hardware and say, if it all went wrong, where would the problem be? How reliable is our hardware? How replaceable is our hardware? Maybe we can go out and buy one off the shelf and maybe you can't, particularly if you're running with older versions of hardware. They generally are not replaceable quickly. Your software and your data integrity. If you are running old versions of Windows, if you're running Windows XP and you lose your machine, where do you go and buy a copy of XP? Because it's almost impossible to find one for sale. Your own data. If you haven't got it copied, nobody else in the world has. And loss of the overall facility, including your data communications, including your wireless capabilities. These days we worry very much about the loss of facility. I question why. For many organizations, loss of the facility is the least of their problems. You can get hardware, you can get communication lines, and in an emergency you can normally get sufficient to keep you going fairly easily. Not always true, depends on the size of the organization and the nature of the organization. So where is your organization? Well, you can evaluate your preparedness. And typically when you start looking at it, ideally we'd like to be at very good. The organization is ready for virtually any eventuality. A disaster should have no material effect on the business, no matter what kind it is. One or two organizations are in that situation. Most organizations hope that they are sitting good. Organization could recover from the loss of computing capability with some cost, but very little public embarrassment. It should be fairly transparent to the users, to the customers, but it will cost us some money. Adequate, we could recover. We know that we should be able to recover from the loss of our computer capability at some cost and some red faces. Weak, disaster would result in conspicuous interruption of our IT services to our customers and could result in loss of business. Down to the bottom of the line, poor. The organization is highly vulnerable to damage to its data processing capability, which could jeopardize its corporate survival. Now notice, it's its data processing capability, not its IT site. Its ability to process its own information or have somebody else process it for them could put you out of business. So when we're looking at auditing disaster recovery planning, we're trying to establish within the organization whether it's the computer or whether you can do this for the overall corporate plan. Where do we sit? We'd like to be very good. It may not be cost effective to be very good. Maybe good is good enough with our risk profile and our risk appetite. But hopefully we're at least adequate, so we can audit against that. So what do we need for our contingency plan? Well, up front, this is going to cost money. It's going to cost money to develop the plan. It's going to cost money to maintain the plan. So we need some kind of board level sponsorship, whether it's a committee or an individual at board level who stands behind it. We need to identify within all of our systems that we have, and I include the clerical systems as well as the computer systems, which are the key systems, and prioritize them. Prioritized based on unavailability. If they're out of action for 24 hours, which ones would be the key ones to recover? 1 to 2 days, 2 to 3 days, 1 week, 1 month. Which systems do we have that if we never ever recovered them, nobody would notice? And that has to be done calendarized, because it depends on the time of month, it depends on the time of year. When a system can be unavailable for 24 hours and nobody would worry too badly. To do that, where do we start? We start off, as with any other form of audit, with a risk analysis. to look at how vulnerable the organization could be to unavailability of our systems. From that we can develop our plan outline and establish a recovery team. Who's going to be doing what? Who on the user side, who on the clerical side, who on the management side, who on the IT side, who on the audit side are going to be involved in this recovery process. We can do a resource analysis. If we've established which systems have to be recovered in which order, what resources do we need to recover that? And I'm talking men, money, materials, machines and methods, the 5 M's. Based on the resource requirement, then we can select our backup facility. Is it possible to back up in-house? Is it financially feasible? Is it desirable? Should we have off-site recovery capability? Even if you're not using the cloud, should we develop a cloud-based backup capability? We need to document our plan, document the procedures, and document the tasks. Prepare your off-site storage. Now, I don't have a large computer site in my offices, but I do have off-site storage. Test the plan, educate the people to their role in the plan, and then maintain it and review it, because you're going to have to change it. If you're going to use a risk analysis, first thing you have to realize is that the risk analysis is going to take time, and we don't have time. So it's going to have to be simple, it's going to have to be quick. You're not going to get down into the nuts and bolts and the nitty-gritty for a risk analysis. It's got to be easily understood and easily updated, because it's going to be updated on an ongoing basis. And it's got to cover all of your systems capability, your clerical systems, your decision support systems, your decision-making systems, and your automated systems. You need to determine the dependencies. It could well be that you could fully recover all of your systems, but you are dependent on one key member of staff who's dropped down dead, or even worse, who's now left you and gone to the competition. As far as our planning is concerned, we have to go back to square one as far as our disaster planning and define our purpose, scope and strategy as far as our DRP is concerned, or our corporate contingency plan if we're taking it to the full organization. Determine the recovery requirements, which jobs, in which order, using which resources, and then arrange a backup site. Now, if we're talking about corporate, it could be a backup set of offices for us to use. If it's a computer site, we've got some choices. A hot site, a warm site, or a cold site. A hot site is virtually a duplication of what we've already got. It's sitting, it's humming, it's got our software loaded onto it, it's got our data loaded onto it. It's a mirror image of our site, and it's going to be expensive. So if we cannot afford a hot site, we can go for a warm site. A warm site says we buy time on somebody else's site, which is as close to a duplicate of what we've got. Not necessarily our whole site, but the bits that we need to run in an emergency. We can have that and have that as a warm site. We need that degree of warmness to be how long will it take for us to be up and running. Are we talking about within an hour? Are we talking about within a day? How warm do you need it? Because again, you're going to have to pay for it. Cold site is basically an empty computer room with an agreement with the supplier that in an emergency you can deliver within 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever is your requirement to get the software, to get the hardware in there, to get the software loaded onto it, to get your data in there, to get your communication lines connected up, and to move you into a warm state. Okay, so we need to figure out which of those is appropriate. And it may well be that it's a combination, that we will have a very hot site or a very warm site, almost a hot site, which will be available to us based on our contract for 48 hours. In that 48 hours, we will activate our cold site and get some new equipment in there, and then we can move out of the hot site, which is costing us money. Some form of combination. But before you can do that, you have to decide, if that's what we're going to try and do, what are our recovery activities that will need to be carried out? And who's going to do them? So who's responsible and who's going to staff it? Define our procedures to test the plan and maintain the plan. Bear in mind, we could, perhaps, fall back to our manual systems. Rarely possible. We could fall back within the organization. Effective, but expensive. You're going to have 2 computers. You could go for a reciprocal arrangement where someone with a similar configuration to yourself makes time on their machine available in a disaster, and you will make time on your machine available if they have a disaster. Problem, you've got to keep those 2 in sync. You're both going to want to run the full machine at the same time, guaranteed. All kinds of problems with reciprocal agreements. So if you're running with that, be very careful, and from an audit perspective, check what is actually contracted to be available to you in a disaster, for how long and when. At minimum, we will require some form of copies of our files. Now we're talking computer files. It could be that, for example, if you are a pension fund, the most critical file that you've got is the file of original documents signed giving you the authority to process pension transactions on behalf of this employee. That could be the critical file that you have to have a copy of. It could be copies of computer files, it could be copies of programs. It could be copies of the operating system if you're running a unique or a uniquely tailored version of the operating system. It could be your documentation. Auditors love to go into IT and say, documentation in this area is inadequate. And IT immediately respond with, inadequate for what? Well, there's one of your inadequacies. Could you recover with the documentation that's available? Do you have an alternate facility of whatever type? And do you have a plan? We start off by modeling the business, because disaster recovery planning, whether it's an IT disaster or a corporate contingency plan, is a business problem. So we look at what is our business made up of, accounting, marketing, MIS, whatever. And then we need to identify which within those are mission critical to the organization. Once we've established mission critical areas of operations for the organization, then we can start looking at data flow within them and dependencies within it. So that accounting is dependent on information from production and from marketing, production from accounting and from MIS. MIS supplies to marketing, accounting, payroll, everybody else. Identify which are the critical business performance areas and which are the critical success factors to make those things work for the organization. Once we've established that, then we can map onto that our business systems and our dependent systems, including the manual ones. And we plan for our disaster recovery when we plan the connections within our systems. At feasibility study stage, if you're talking IT. And that's enough of my voice for a while. Let's stop and have our first polling question. And our polling questions. Polling question number 1 says, a risk analysis for the contingency plan should be which of those below? All vote now. Once again, as Jim said, you don't have to get the answer right, but you do have to vote to get CPD. It proves that you've not actually fallen asleep no matter what I've said. Okay, we've just got a couple of people still. And that's everyone voted. I will close the plan and I will share the results. Okay, most people have gone for simple and quick. Some have gone for manual, some have gone for automated, some have gone for documented electronically. I did go into one client where they were showing me their new fully automated, fully electronically documented disaster recovery plan. He said it can handle any contingency. So I reached over and switched off his screen and said, show me your recovery. Right. Does anyone have a copy of that printed? So be careful with electronic documentation and automated. As long as you've got backup copies for your electronic documentation and a way to read it, fine. But the risk analysis must be simple and it must be quick. One way or the other. So, if that's where we start, making the first move, I said we have to start off by establishing the terms of reference. And I said it has to be firmly recognized and accepted that policy decisions and overall responsibility stays entirely with top management. So we need to identify in an emergency, who do we go and speak to? We're going to have to get someone to declare an emergency. Who is authorized to do that? Who do we tell? And establish our emergency strategies. Now you cannot set up emergency strategies as a theory. You have to say in an emergency, who is going to make the phone calls? Who are they going to call? What perils are they going to be looking for? And then study all of the components which potentially are under threat. Now, if we know what the risks are, and we know what components we're worried about, then we can assess the effectiveness of our existing defences, our preventative controls, our detective controls. Remember, the disaster recovery plan is a corrective control. It says our preventative controls have failed. We know that because we have detected something going wrong, that nothing is catered for. We now need to move into a corrective situation. It may well be that we can toughen up our preventative controls in order to reduce the need to actually execute our disaster recovery plan. We need to look for our high risk and high exposure areas. Look at your current insurance position. I was doing a review of a disaster recovery plan for a client, and they had this was covered in insurance and that was covered in insurance and everything was wonderful. Until I looked at the caveats and the clauses, and buried within them was a line that said, except in the Northern Ireland or the Republic of South Africa. And it basically invalidated the whole insurance policy. So nothing was covered in South Africa. But they'd been paying a premium for this every year and saying, we're okay, we've got DRP. I've been to another client where they had extensive insurance cover, but the insurance policy had lapsed 4 months before and nobody had actually noticed. So what's your current insurance position? Check out your management awareness level. Do they understand where they sit in terms of disaster recovery planning? When we talk about the components, We have to look at our hardware, and that's the obvious one and the easy one to look at. But you also have to look at the system software. It may be that you have an application system, maybe a legacy system, which is running under an old version of the operating system. The application system would not run under a modern version of the same operating system. So you better have that system software backed up. Because if you can't recover it, maybe the manufacturer cannot give you a version. Your application software, if it was developed in-house, you better have it backed up. You cannot buy an alternative. If it's a package that you've bought, you may be able to buy a new version of the package, but you may have to tailor it to make it fit with the data that you've got right now. An awful lot of companies, when it came to Y2K, upgraded all of the systems, converted all of the software, converted all of their data files, and then threw away the conversion programs. And they were in the situation in some cases where they kept a year's worth of backups, but they had no software that would run those backups because they didn't have the conversion programs that would convert the backups to the latest version required by the software. Data storage mediums, whether you store on disk, whether you store on tape, whether you store online. Documentation. Do you have adequate documentation? Do you have adequate documentation on your hot site or stored away off-site, including special stationery? It may well be that when you are running your invoices, you need special invoice stationery. Maybe the computer is going to produce it for you, maybe it's not. How do you back up your people? And that's one of the critical components of documentation. That's how you back up what's in people's heads. If that person is not available, we can do cross-training and all kinds of wonderful things. But what's in your documentation is how you back up what's in people's heads. Also affected would be your cash flow. Now, you may not be able to do anything about your cash flow. You may be. One of the insurance policies that is available from Lloyd's of London is a disaster recovery policy. And what it says is if you have a disaster, and there are various caveats as to whether you have a disaster recovery plan, etc., etc. But if you have a disaster and your cash flow gets knocked for 6, they will provide, the insurance company will provide a guarantee to the bank to cover your cash flow so that the bank won't just cut you off. Now, it's not a cheap insurance policy, and they do want some assurance that you'll probably survive. There are also vulnerable remote sites. So your disaster recovery plan needs to cater for them as well if they're a critical part of the infrastructure. You also need to check out your contracts and your commitments to your customers as well as to your suppliers. Your telecoms and your networks, your buildings, your services, and all of those manual interfacing systems will all be affected in the event, or potentially affected in the event of a disaster. Also potentially affected, your work in progress. And your work in progress, again, could include systems which have been developed. It could be a question of identifying your time schedules, locating your documentation, or simply test versions of systems, or SDLC. Your SDLC status reports, they could be critical. It would be a crying shame if you spent 2 years putting a project together to implement a new version of SAP. You have a disaster, you recover all of your live systems, and you've lost that 2 years worth of development work. and you were only 1 month away from going live. Documentation has to be up to date, has to be stored securely. It has to record known weaknesses, and it has to reflect dependencies. As it has to be kept up to date, it has to reflect changes. And built into that documentation has to be in authority levels, including the authority levels in the event of a disaster, because they may be different. It may not be the same people who have the same authority levels in an emergency situation as have during normal. Their user profiles may have to change. Looking at your insurance position, look at the schedule of coverage. Check out damage, whether you're covered for damage or loss to property, plant and equipment, hardware, software and data, documentation and key personnel. And one of the hardest ones to get insurance cover for is your data, because it's unique to you. You can get insurance cover even for key personnel. But remember, you're looking for coverage for a degree of damage. It could be anything from people being unavailable temporarily to having to replace them completely. Look at the protection against computer misuse. I was across at the underwriters at Lloyd's on one occasion, and a phone call came in from a client of mine in South Africa, and they said, how much would it cost us to have anti-hacking insurance? And they said to me, what do you think? Do you think they're a good risk? I said, I think they're an excellent risk because you've already covered them. They've got the comprehensive computer crime policy from you, and that covers them for hackers. So if you try and sell them another one now, I'll go back and tell them that you're double charging. Oh, okay, fine. I've got a couple of questions that have come in, which I'll try and answer. First says, from a best practice perspective, how does change management link with disaster recovery planning? Do contingency plans need to be updated as systems are rolled out? Yes. And the answer is very short and simple, yes. Part of the change management process should be to look at the role of this particular change or system within your existing contingency plan. And does that role change? If the answer is that the contingency, this particular piece of software has no place in the contingency plan, my question would be, well, why are you making changes to it? It's not a mission critical system. There are plenty of mission critical systems that need to be there. The second question is, I know it's probably lunchtime on the East Coast, but we can hear whoever is chewing on the webinar. So all I can say, Stacey, it's not me.
Sorry, it was me.
Thanks, Jim. Okay. I hope that's answered that question. It is an industry standard. It's not too ideal. It should be there. And when a new system is being developed, in that initial feasibility study should be a section that says where this new system will fit in the contingency plan. And it may well, you may well find that this system, this new proposed system, is so touchy, it will explode if it goes wrong, that there is no place that we can put it in the disaster recovery plan, and we shouldn't touch it with a barge pole. And that should be part of the feasibility. Is this system, when we develop it, going to be recoverable? If the answer is no, leave it. Look at the areas for protection against misuse, misuse of data, disclosure of data. Now, we tend not to think about unauthorized disclosure of data as being a computer disaster. That could put you out of business. So disclosure of data should be part of your computer disaster recovery plan if loss of that confidentiality would be a disaster. If unavailability of your systems are going to result in other organizations making loss claims, consequential loss claims against your insurance, that could be disastrous. Are you covered? When we talk about loss of people, including in that is your public liability. If your building goes up in smoke, what is your public liability if your customers are in your building? What about if your employees are there? What about employers' liability, as well as your general business interruption? Check out the general exceptions, what is excluded from insurance. Check out the general conditions. It may well be that your insurance policy requires you to have documented to a certain level your disaster recovery plan testing on an ongoing basis, and you are required to make ongoing declarations that it is being tested. Failure to make those declarations could invalidate your insurance. Check your policy. I said lines of reporting. Again, when we start talking lines of reporting, we need to look at, in an emergency, who's going to be in charge? Very common in a disaster situation that the board of directors immediately start running around like chickens with their head cut off. They are not in charge. Your disaster management person is in charge. In the same way in a building, if it goes on fire, the person who's in charge is the fire brigade, not the owner of the building. So who is in charge? What is their role? Do they know it? The board's responsibility is generally to handle the PR and stay away from the disaster. PR is a big enough disaster in its own right if you have a problem. So who's in charge? What's his role? Who's his backup? What if your disaster is that your person in charge isn't available? Who are the key personnel? Who are their backups? What autonomous groups exist that are going to be outside of this plan? How do you bring them in? And who maintains the plan? Now, from a management perspective, all of these questions need to be answered. From an audit perspective, we need to ensure that somebody is capable of answering those questions. Our emergency strategies have to contain alternatives for our key systems, for our disaster potential, and for disruption periods. So we need to look at a disaster area, an IT area disaster on all operating areas. If it was not available, if it was available but wrong, if it was available but slow, how would each operational area be affected? Strategies need to be defined under pre-planning definition stage, functional requirement stage, system design stage, and I include non-IT systems as well as IT systems, implementation stage, testing stage, and that critical continuity and maintenance stage. What you unfortunately find in a lot of systems is audit gets involved right up front in the development of new computer systems or the implementation of new computer systems, and an awful lot of controls get built in. Over a period of time, the controls are found to be a bit onerous, so they are maintained out of the system. And its role in DRP can also be maintained out of the system if you're not careful. So, teams. Now this is working on the assumption that you have unlimited resources. So we will have a management team, we will have a user team, we will have a facilities team, a telecommunications team. We will have all of those teams. And down at the bottom we will have a recovery team. That's in the best of all worlds, with unlimited resources. You don't typically have unlimited resources. You have one person who is the management, the user, and in charge of facilities. The telecom team is the system software team, is the operations team. All of those need to have a membership on the recovery team. So we need input from management, users, facilities, the lot on that recovery team. We identify by types of system, typically by their operating objective. You can also identify them as to whether they are centralized, standalone, distributed, real-time, online, batch, together with the degrees of priority for recovery purposes. We can categorize systems by the impact of a stoppage, whether the stoppage is due to the computer system going up in flames, or the network being down, or the customers not being able to get through on the telephone. That could be a disaster. I had one client who I was looking at the computer systems and everything seemed fine, and as we were driving out of the front gate, there was a steep hill and a bend to come round to come through the front gate. And just inside it was a little box. I said, "What's that?" "Oh, that's our telephone systems. All of our lines go through there." I said, "Well, what would happen if a truck missed the corner and took that out?" "Oh, hadn't thought about that." I said, "Well, if I were you, I would move that from where it is, but in the meantime, put some concrete bollards or metal stanchions or something around it." 1 week later, a truck took out the front gate and came to a standstill against the concrete bollards. Pure luck. Not because I'm brilliant, just pure luck. So, categorize by the effect of the stoppage. Identify the essential interfacing systems, computer and manual, and document the lot, including business loss rating. Now, business loss rating doesn't necessarily mean if it's gone, it's going to be gone forever. There could be an alternate level of service during an emergency. In a bank, it may well be that in an emergency, if you have a loss of power, you've got a standby generator, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will run every single teller's terminal. Maybe you're down to 2 teller terminals instead of 20. Is that enough? What is the alternate service level which is going to be required at peak times? What is your maximum downtime before it becomes mission critical? Our other systems are clerical systems. Document them all. We've normally got good documentation on our computer systems. We normally have rubbish documentation on our clerical systems. So we need to document those or make sure they are documented. Identify the relationships and the effect of stoppage on your clerical systems. And that could mean that you need to check for alternate accommodation, alternate people, stationary office equipment, or simply alternate control procedures. If you have only limited resources available, and I don't know anyone who has got a disaster recovery plan who has been given an unlimited budget, grade your systems for recovery and agree that with management before the disaster. Guaranteed when the disaster strikes, there will be someone on the management team who gives a very good reason why their system needs to be brought up first. Dependencies must be taken into consideration. Documentation archived and run priorities agreed with management depending on when the disaster strikes. And that brings us to our next polling question. And our next polling question says, IT systems may be separately identified for. Please vote now. We have 91% voted. I'll give it a couple of seconds and then I'll close the votes. Remember, you don't have to get it right, you just have to vote. Okay. Closing it now. I'll share the results. You can see we have a split by operating objectives and the effective stoppage. And both of those are correct. Generally speaking, we can identify our IT systems by their operating objectives. That's where we start. Then we can look at the effective stoppage. But it may not necessarily be a stoppage. If you know what the operating objectives of the system, that particular business area is, or that particular system is, it could just be that it's going very slowly. It's not actually stopped. It could be that information has been disclosed and our operating objectives to keep confidentiality. The danger is that we always assume that the disaster recovery plan is to go into effect when we have lost our systems. Not always true. Okay, so it depends on the circumstances. Okay, let's take a look at backups. What do we back up? Do we need them for all systems or only for essential systems? What we do require is we need enough hardware, software and people, whether it's specialists or users, to keep our essential systems going, and enough to recover ultimately all of our systems. So you may not in your disaster recovery plan for a type A disaster say we will recover everything in sight initially. You may recover only your essential systems, but ultimately we would like to get back to normal running, and that means that we're going to have to recover all of our systems, so we are going to need backups for all of our systems. Our infrastructure, backups for infrastructure. Remember, it's easy to say we will back up by having a hot site which gives us a computer site. Where are you going to put your people? If your office block has gone up in smoke, yes, it's taken out your computer site, but it's also taken out all of your offices, all of your terminals, all of your data communications, all of your power and services. And it might even have taken out your people. It could well be